Everyone knows the characters in horror movies rarely make good decisions. But have you ever wondered what it would look like if they only made the worst possible choices? The Jack in the Box is the perfect example of that idea, and it's even worse than you could imagine. Every character, including the main villain, managed to spectacularly avoid doing anything remotely close to smart throughout the entire movie. Also, the main character is literally the weakest person I've ever seen. All it takes is a single slap from Jack to knock him out for hours at a time, yet he continually tries to pick fights despite his constant crushing losses. There's so much to unravel with this insane movie, so let's start right from the beginning. The movie starts with the discovery of the Jack in the Box by an old man, who I'll be calling Mr. Old. After he digs up the box and brings it home with him, he shows it to his wife, before randomly deciding to leave the room. Within seconds of Mr. O leaving the room, Jack decides to reveal himself to the wife as he begins to climb out of the box. Somehow, even though the wife immediately started running and screaming, Mr. O failed to notice that there was anything wrong until after she'd already been dragged into the box. He manages to get there too late to help her, and she's locked away inside the box for good. We then transition to 12 years later, where we meet our main character, Casey. Now, when I first saw this movie, I went in expecting Casey to be an absolute Chad that would strike fear into the hearts of evil Jack in the Boxes everywhere, but I couldn't have been any more wrong. That will become a major issue later, but for now, Casey is starting a new job at his local museum, where he meets his coworker Lisa. She leads him to a strange room where he begins looking through old artifacts before discovering the Jack in the Box. Since he obviously wasn't paying attention during the movie's intro, Casey ends up flipping one of its switches, which awakens the box and allows the strange doll to appear. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, it's suddenly nighttime and there's a robbery going on in the museum with the most unlucky group of robbers of all time. They somehow managed to choose to rob the only building that had a demonic Jack in the Box mere hours after it was awoken. Obviously, this poor timing means they get chumped by Jack, and one of them somehow manages to get killed without even making a single noise. Here begins the running trend of everyone who encounters Jack making the worst possible choices, since the other robber hears some slight thumping sounds and inexplicably decides to start playing hide and seek. Somehow, he managed to choose the worst hiding spot of all time, since he is found almost immediately by Jack, and as punishment for losing, he gets his noggin crushed. Next, we see Casey and Lisa having dinner in a nearby diner, which means the robbery was happening almost immediately after the museum closed, which is a very strange time to stage a robbery. Anyway, we learn a little more about Lisa and Casey in their conversation at the diner, and find out that Lisa hates working at the museum, while Casey wants to travel the world to learn more about the industry, because he's a nerd. Then we see later that night where Casey is having a strange nightmare about his girlfriend getting chased down the street by a strange hooded figure. The dream ends with her getting caught. Then we cut to the next day where Casey arrives at work to see that there's been a break-in, but he realizes that the robbers forgot to steal anything since they were too busy playing with Jack. Unfortunately, the security cameras in the museum don't work, and the owner refuses to fix them throughout the course of the movie, which allows Jack free range over the entirety of the museum the whole time. Casey ends up calling an expert to take a look at the Jack in the Box, and when Casey asks if he's ever seen anything like it, he says,
Not unless you're including my grandson's toy box.
so I guess his grandson will be dying any day now. Also, the expert must have been studying his grandson's toy chest, since he inexplicably knows almost everything there is to know about Jack. He says that the box could have been made in order to contain an evil entity, and that in Legends they would have been unleashed upon the community once someone opened it. Since the expert apparently wasn't paying attention earlier when the robbers got murdered by Jack, he doesn't believe there's actually a demon inside the box. After the expert leaves, Casey ends up falling asleep since he decided to have a nightmare instead of sleeping the night before. A random visitor wakes him up and asks him for directions to the war exhibit before he immediately goes back to sleep. Now we finally get to see Jack in action for real when the visitor foolishly wanders off on her own and then the lights immediately turn off. The visitor has a strange reaction to this situation and responds to the lights turning off with this.
Getting a bit claustrophobic in here.
Then she immediately gets grabbed by Jack out of nowhere with the lamest death I've ever seen. It literally just looks like someone randomly drew a red line across her neck with a marker, but apparently it's enough to kill her. Despite waking up to the sound of screaming, Casey takes so long to investigate that Jack has enough time to bring the body into the box. He apparently also cleaned up the blood from his kill, since Casey somehow didn't notice that anything is wrong. We suddenly cut to Casey later that night, where he seems to be unable to sleep well. which is probably because he spent his days sleeping even while people were actively dying around him. Since he can't sleep, Casey decides to practice looking sad in the mirror and does so with some incredible success. The next day, Casey happens to run to the missing poster of the woman who died at the museum and realizes that it was probably her screaming for help the day before. We also see a missing poster for the robbers, but I guess they were short on paper, so they had to make them share. Next, Casey decides to look for a professional demonologist to make sure that his box is demon-free. Luckily, he somehow finds a website that has all the information he needs about Jack, except how to defeat him, which would be pretty helpful at this point. On the website, there's a list of Jack's supposed skills, most of which aren't even skills. They have both his height and claws listed as a skill on the site, neither of which qualify as an actual skill. They also list one of his skills as enhanced speed and agility, which we're definitely going to be bringing up later. The only skill on the list that Jack actually has is the enhanced strength, so at least they got one of the 4 correct. Apparently, whoever made the website is an expert on Jack in the Box demons, since they knew that Jack would be activated by opening the box and his goal is to eat 6 people, but they don't mention any way to stop him. While Casey is distracted reading through the site, the puppet inside the box turns to look at him for literally no reason, giving away its evilness to Casey. Unfortunately, Casey gets distracted from his staring contest by the manager arriving at the building, so Jack moves to an early 1-0 lead in his fights against Casey. The manager leaves after telling Casey to put the box on display, so he does before closing the museum for the day. Even though the manager made sure to tell him to lock the doors before he leaves, he goes home while there's still a cleaner inside the building. So either he locked the cleaner in the building, or he completely failed to make sure that the museum was locked for the night. So he completely ignored one of the only 2 tasks he was given by the manager. While the cleaner is cleaning Jack's exhibit, she makes the foolish mistake of insulting him for being creepy.
Who'd let their child anywhere near you?
This makes Jack so upset that he decides to teleport straight out of his display case in this incredibly spooky scene.
You'll have to be quicker than that.
Then when she tries to escape from the room, she runs into Jack's box on the stairs and he reveals a power that the website apparently forgot to mention. His ability to close doors telekinetically. A power that he only uses in this scene and one other time, even though it would be extremely helpful throughout the rest of the movie. If I was in this situation, I would probably jump over the railing and try to escape. But the cleaner decides to make the foolish decision of attempting to sneak past the Jack in the Box on the stairs. Unfortunately for her, the stairs are very creaky, and the Jack in the Box starts to play its music. Then when she tries to make a run for it, she realizes that he also has the ability to telekinetically lock doors, so there's no escape for her. Alternatively, there's a chance that Casey just decided to lock her inside the building when he left, and that's why she couldn't escape. Anyway, Jack gets behind her and kills her with a single slap, achieving his 4th kill out of the 6 he needs. Now we learn about what happened to Casey's girlfriend when he makes the strange decision of listening to the voicemail that caused his earlier nightmares. This wouldn't be super unusual, but he decided to listen to it in the middle of the museum on speakerphone, which allowed Lisa to overhear the message. Casey explains that his girlfriend called him in the middle of the night, but he ghosted her because he was sleepy. That caused her to leave the voicemail of her being followed and attacked, which resulted in her death. Then, immediately after Casey explains everything, a detective shows up at the museum to ask questions about the missing cleaner that Jack killed. Casey agrees to answer the detective's questions to try and help the investigation, and does a great job of making himself look extremely suspicious. When the detective asks if anything has happened out of the ordinary, Casey takes a massive pause before starting to tell a story about the Jack in the Box turning its head to look at him. Except instead of telling the whole story, he says that he saw something strange before deciding to end the interview. Combined with the fact that the cameras at the museum don't work, all Casey's interview managed to do was make himself look like the obvious suspect for her disappearance. Casey decides that he hasn't made himself look suspicious enough, so he randomly decides to ask the detective whether he believes in the supernatural. The detective claims that he doesn't believe in supernatural forces and explains that in his experience, a person with a strange story is likely trying to cover up for their own crimes. Casey's response is to make himself seem even more suspicious by going completely silent, since I guess he really wants to get arrested. Then Casey makes a call to the demonologist expert about the Jack in the Box, but doesn't get an answer. In response to being ghosted, Casey decides to call Andy, who will be able to track down the demonologist by the next day. Then once the lights go out, for some reason Casey decides to look around the museum, even though he's extremely suspicious that the Jack in the Box is murderous. Once Casey sees the box laying in the hallway, his flashlight immediately goes out, and he doesn't get it working until Jack is standing right in front of him. After a single slap from Jack, Casey gets knocked straight onto the ground, and Jack starts making goofy faces at him as he fades into unconsciousness. This moves his record against Jack to 0-2, and he stays unconscious for literal hours before being discovered by Lisa. Once Lisa finds Casey unconscious on the floor after his crushing loss, he insists on showing her the camera footage of the Jack-in-the-Box. Unfortunately, Jack has yet another power that the website failed to mention, and he simply glitches out of the camera so it looks like he never moved. Casey shares his theory with Lisa that the cleaner was killed in the museum, although at this point he should be much more certain in his theory after he was already attacked by Jack. Lisa strangely doesn't accept his theory, even though this entire situation was obviously caused by a demonic Jack-in-the-Box. Also, he now has this tiny cut on his forehead, but throughout the conversation he treats it as if he was severely wounded.
Yeah, look what it did to me.
Lisa then presents her own theory about what happened to the cleaner, explaining that she had been going through relationship issues and was already planning to run away. Clearly, Lisa's theory is much more believable, but for some reason Casey still refuses to accept her theory and continues to go with the killer Jack-in-the-Box one. But Casey leaves the room and happens to find the address that the Jack-in-the-Box came to the museum from, just randomly laying on the floor. Then after some minor stalking, he figures out that the person living there was held responsible for the murder of his wife. He's the man from the intro and was blamed for the murder of his wife, despite the fact that it was clearly the Jack-in-the-Box. For some reason, they didn't believe his story about Jack being responsible, so he ended up in prison, although he'd already been released by the time Jack started killing again. Casey manages to hunt down the location of his house and decides to pay him a visit later that day. When he arrives at the house, he runs into Mr. Old, who immediately starts to threaten him with a fire poker. Mr. Old is threatening Casey because everyone believes that he's responsible for the murder of his wife, but threatening random people probably isn't helping his case much. Luckily, Casey is able to escape being poked by explaining that he's activated the box. For some reason, Mr. Old has to ask whether Casey has seen Jack, despite the incredibly severe injury on Casey's forehead, something only a creature like Jack could manage. Mr. Old agrees to share his story and explains that he found and opened the Jack-in-the-Box before leaving to go back into the house. Since he left his wife behind with the Jack-in-the-Box, she gets attacked almost immediately, and he somehow doesn't notice anything is wrong until she's already getting dragged into the box. The police ended up arresting him, and since he was trying to blame a random Jack-in-the-Box for the disappearance of his wife, he was considered the prime suspect. In the end, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Mr. Old never mentions any more victims after his wife, even though we know that Jack's goal is to kill 6 people. So either Jack forgot to kill the other people, or he somehow managed to kill 5 people in that random field he was found. Mr. Old advises Casey to leave town before people try to blame him for the recent murders, which seems like a great way to make yourself look even more suspicious. Luckily, the ghost of Casey's girlfriend randomly appears to convince him to go back to help stop Jack, so he heads back towards the museum. We cut to Casey at the museum, where he kidnaps the Jack-in-the-Box and takes it to a random field where he sets it on fire. For some reason, he makes the idiotic decision to leave without ensuring that the Jack-in-the-Box was destroyed. Once Casey arrives back at the museum, Jack is already there waiting for him, since remember, Jack has the ability to teleport. Now we finally get to see Jack in action after Casey foolishly decides to run straight into a dead end where he doesn't have any way to escape. We get to see another action-packed fight between Jack and Casey. Remember, Jack is already up 2-0, but there's still time for a comeback. The fight begins with a light slap from Jack, knocking Casey onto the floor. However, there's already some improvement from last time, since Casey is at least still conscious after that first slap. For some reason, the slap seems to have done severe damage to Casey's legs, since he spends the rest of the fight crawling around. Casey makes a sad attempt to crawl towards a fire hydrant, as if that would somehow give him any chance of winning the fight, but he gets grabbed by Jack before he can reach it. This could be a hint towards a possible weakness for Jack, since he was clearly worried enough about the fire hydrant to stop Casey from getting a hold of it. This is about where the fight ends, since Jack lightly throws Casey at the ground, which is apparently enough to knock him out once again. This moves Jack being up a clean 3-0 score in his fights against Casey, with each of their fights being flawless wins for Jack. Now, apparently Casey being lightly tossed on the ground was enough to knock him out until it was literally the next day, since Lisa finds him in the same spot the next morning. The manager calls a meeting with Lisa and Casey where we get our first look at the massive damage Casey took in his recent battle. That's a truly terrifying wound, so now we can tell why he was knocked out for such a long time after their fight. Personally, this made the movie much less believable for me, since there's no way someone could survive an injury so severe in real life. Unfortunately, the manager also finds Casey's story unbelievable, but because of the evil Jack-in-the-Box part, so she ends up firing him from the museum. For some reason, Casey seems confused that Lisa doesn't trust him about the Jack-in-the-Box being evil, as if he thinks that's a normal suggestion. He finally gets a call back from Andy, giving him the address where he can find the demonologist, and he heads off to visit their house. Once he arrives at the demonologist's house, the demonologist explains that he's been purposely avoiding Casey's calls, although he never actually explains why. With minimal effort, Casey is able to convince him to help stop Jack. Apparently, Casey's been leaving messages throughout the week explaining the situation, and the demonologist has listened to all of them. This means he was well aware of the fact that people were dying, but chose not to help for literally no reason. Since he somehow knows everything there is to know about Jack, he explains that the reason Casey has survived so far is because he was the one who opened the box, which means the demon can't kill him. During this discussion, we see what's going on back at the museum, where Jack is once again revealing a random new ability, turning the box into a blender and sucking the manager inside. The demonologist explains that the only way to beat Jack is for Casey to trap him inside the box. This can only be done by first stabbing Jack through the heart and then saying an incantation to trap him inside the box. The only problem with this plan is that Casey is the one being sent, and his chances of successfully stabbing Jack are incredibly low considering how weak he is. Right before Casey leaves, the demonologist says that any part of Jack being left outside the box would cause the ritual to fail and allow Jack to come back to kill his victims. Now we cut back to the museum where Lisa finds out about the manager's death when she discovers her dismembered body in the bathroom. This is the only time in the entire movie that Jack leaves any evidence behind after killing someone, since he leaves the bathroom covered in blood and leaves an entire foot outside the box. Right before Lisa escapes the building, Jack is able to use his telekinetic powers to lock the door, trapping her inside. Lisa makes the first smart decision of the entire movie when she runs away from Jack and he shows how incredibly slow he is. Unfortunately, the good choices don't last long, and Lisa runs into a dead end where she starts screaming, leading Jack straight to her location. At this point, I want to remind you that one of Jack's skills was super speed, despite the fact that he spends his time walking around at this slow pace. For some reason, Jack decides to not instantly murder Lisa, and instead stabs her in the stomach with his claws. Before he's able to kill her, though, he hears Casey's voice in the museum, which is apparently enough to distract him from finishing the kill. Once again, Jack and Casey come head to head when Casey starts looking through the museum for Lisa. Since Jack is upset about being distracted from his kill, he ends the fight quickly by scratching Casey on the cheek. This is apparently one of Casey's many weak spots, since it's enough to knock him out somehow. Again, Jack does not kill Lisa and instead decides to slowly drag her through the museum towards the box. Somehow, despite his massive injuries, Casey manages to regain consciousness and goes to save Lisa. Apparently, though, the injury to his cheek is much more severe than it looks, since he starts crawling throughout the museum despite the fact that he's barely even hurt. Casey ends up crawling into the main hall where Lisa and Jack are waiting, but luckily neither of them see him somehow. Jack still refuses to kill Lisa and instead starts having a staring contest with her. Fortunately, Lisa is very good at staring contests, so it goes on long enough for Casey to slowly crawl over to them with the fire poker in hand. Then right before attacking, Casey somehow regains his ability to stand, despite his clearly extensive injuries, and stabs Jack through the heart with his fire poker. Lisa nearly gets stabbed in the face with the fire poker too, but luckily Jack is able to toss her out of the way. Apparently being stabbed in the heart causes Jack's box to turn against him, as it sucks him back inside by force. At this point, we see the worst decision of the entire movie when Casey inexplicably decides to screen the enchantment before Jack is fully back inside the box. There was literally no reason to say it early, considering that the box was actively sucking Jack back inside, and Casey could clearly see that there was still a claw sticking out of the box. This obviously causes the box to close too soon, cutting off Jack's claw and leaving it outside of the box. Somehow, Casey doesn't notice the massive splash of blood or the claw falling out, despite the fact that he was staring at the box while it happened. For some reason, Casey chooses this exact moment to regain his ability to stand, which happens to be right when the police arrive at the building. Casey is immediately arrested since he decided to stand over an unconscious body while being covered in blood, and they throw him straight into prison. Then, after a small time skip, we see Lisa making a visit to the demonologist, where we find out that Casey is being held guilty for the murders. Lisa seems to have fully recovered from being stabbed somehow, despite still having scratches all over her face. Since the demonologist apparently knows everything about Jack, he explains that each kill allows Jack to live another 3 years. That means it's Lisa's responsibility to keep Jack from being found again, and she ends up bringing Jack's box to another empty field to bury him. Then we see Casey being interrogated by the detective from earlier in the movie, where he's trying to make him confess to the murders. When he shows Casey some of the pictures from the crime scene, Casey sees a picture of the claw that fell outside the box and finally realizes that he failed the ritual. Since the ritual failed, he knows that Jack will go after Lisa next to finish off all 6 kills. Then the movie ends with Jack grabbing Lisa and dragging her into the box for his 6th and final kill of the movie, and solidifying his victory. In the end, Jack secured the win with a score of 3 to 0.5, since Casey received half a point for successfully stabbing Jack through the heart, although he still completely failed the ritual afterwards. One of the most wild things about this movie is the fact that Casey visited 3 completely different experts about the Jack in the Box. The first was the toy expert, who explained the origins of the Jack in the Boxes at the beginning of the movie. The second was Mr. Old, who'd seen Jack in action before and believed that there was no way to stop him. And the third was the demonologist, who apparently had all the answers about how to stop Jack, but just didn't feel like sharing them. Most of them weren't even necessary either, since the only one who provides any useful information is the demonologist, who already knew everything that is needed to defeat Jack. The entire movie could have been avoided if the demonologist hadn't inexplicably avoided answering Casey's calls. Also, every time Jack kills someone, he uses the weakest attacks of all time, with little slaps being his main weapon throughout the movie. Any normal person in Casey's position would have been able to handle it significantly better, since a slight scratch wouldn't be enough to knock them out. Overall, these factors are what drag down the movie in my opinion, and although there's a lot of other parts of the movie to enjoy, it's definitely no carved. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Next week, I'm planning on taking a look at Ape vs. Mecha Ape, which is an absolutely insane disaster of a movie where a giant robot ape tries to nuke a city. Make sure to keep an eye out for that one, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye-bye!